I heard it mentioned nationally, and then I also saw people talking about it on our message boards, warchant.com. If you're not a subscriber, what are you waiting on? Football's nearly here. Let's go. And I know Ira addressed it on those boards, or at least linked to where it started from, and that is the idea of Florida State, along with Clemson, perhaps going to the Big 12, or the Big 12 offering a potential landing spot for Florida State. And I actually had some real thoughts on this. I didn't address it at the time yesterday because, frankly, I didn't think it warranted it. But I suppose that anything that involves Florida State and potentially leaving this conference and going to any other conference does require me to address it, and I should address it. And I'll give you my thoughts here. I felt like this was a plant story given to Ross Dellinger because of his relationship with the Big 12 commissioner. Now, Ross, I know Ross Dellinger not well. I like him. I respect him, more importantly. He's a very, very good journalist. There aren't that many left, and he's a good one. So he doesn't run with nonsense, and I don't think he just takes handouts like, hey, here's a story. But understand that in the media world, and we operate this way in really all walks of life, there is an element of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. I think it's partially true in the sense that the Big 12 would love to have Florida State, love to have Clemson, would love to continue to bolster their conference. They've been very aggressive. In fact, their motto is, of course, we're open for business. They're letting everybody know very publicly, hey, come on down. If you're interested, we're here to listen. I mean, this would be like a case of tampering in the open. It's just like we're letting you know, yes, we're coming for your teams. If your conference is half-stepping and not providing what these teams, these programs need, we would like to talk to them because you've fallen asleep on the job. And we don't plan on getting left behind any further. We're going to do the best we can to compete with the Big Two. We know that, or the Power Two as they're now called, we know we're at a disadvantage. But any chance we get to bolster our roster of programs that gives us a fighting chance to someday turn this into a Power Three, we're going to do it. And it would be a huge, huge get. It would be a massive asset for the Big 12 to announce at any point that they've got agreements with Florida State and Clemson, throw in North Carolina, Miami, and Virginia. Who knows? It'd be huge because I think once the ACC begins to crumble, that is exactly what the Big 12 is going to do. They are going to provide a landing spot for the other ACC members that are going to flee like rats on a sinking ship once Florida State is out, once Clemson is out. That conference at that point will have had the legs cut out from under it. It will have no cachet in the football world, and those programs will flee, and they'll go to the Big 12. And I think that's a potential landing spot for Louisville. I think it's a potential landing spot for several programs not named Florida State and Clemson, because what Ross Dellinger also said when asked about that is, I only think that it's a third-rate option for Florida. I'm paraphrasing, for Florida State and Clemson. It's not their plan. It's not what they're endeavoring to do. There's no agreement. There's not even a wink, wink, nod, nod. There's just sort of an understanding that if things don't go well in your effort to get into the Big Ten or your effort to get into the SEC, that is to say Fox or ESPN, perhaps don't claim those assets that they want from the ACC, which I think they will, but let's say they don't for whatever reason, they agree to stand pat, then you have a home here in the Big 12. That's what the commissioner was basically telling Ross Dellinger was, hey, just so you know, we'd love to have Florida State and Clemson. When Florida State filed suit, they did so, I believe, when they did it, partially because they had an understanding. A wink, wink, nod, nod, not official, nobody wants to get sued, understanding with Fox or ESPN about where they would go if they could get out from the ACC contract and the grant of rights and all of that. If they could find their way out, they had an offer. Now, the rumors have been that that offer was from the Big Ten, from Fox, who wants to obviously establish Southern connections. They go coast to coast. They'd have everything from one coast to the other, and they'd have the Midwest to boot. A national conference. They want to plant a flag in the SEC's backyard and gain assets, unique television assets like Florida State, who is, and we talked about this once before. I told you about my buddy on the inside at ESPN who sent me a graph of the way that television partners view Florida State, where they are. There's tier 1. There are only a few teams there. We're not in it. But we're with the next tier, the second tier of elite programs like Oklahoma and other big names. You guys remember we had this conversation. If you don't, go back and listen. I mentioned us in the same breath as some of the biggest names in college football history. Just a notch below a Notre Dame or an Alabama, those kinds of teams that are on a tier above Florida State. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but we understand it, okay? Fox would love to do that. My only question, and I believe they've offered Florida State. I believe there's an understanding, if you will, with Florida State. And perhaps Clemson on the horizon as well. Who knows? We have, obviously, we're not in a position to say yes. We're not in a position to guarantee that we'll take that offer. We're not in a position to say, yeah, we're coming here as soon as we get out from under this. Don't you worry. I think the smart play, like any business, is you're trying to leverage one against the other. Who's going to give you the best offer? The rumor was that offer from Fox, from the Big Ten, was similar to what they did with Washington and Oregon. And go back and look at those terms. Not ideal. Not ideal. Now, they had Washington and Oregon kind of bent over a barrel. The Pac-12 was floundering, was falling to pieces right before their very eyes. People were literally, as I said earlier, they were rats fleeing the sinking ship. Teams had to have somewhere to go. They were all vying for a better place. And they were in the position, perhaps, at that point to maybe have to take a lesser than deal. And so they did. They did. They said, fine, you know what? We got to land somewhere, and eventually we'll make the kind of money. We'll get paid full freight in a few years, and in the interim, we just got to wear a beating here compared to our counterparts in the conference and not take full share, but we're not going to get left out in the cold. We're going to eat from the money trough too someday, so we'll accept that kind of offer. Florida State, I've said all along, is going to be in a better position when they do leave because I think they're going to get full freight right from the jump. You want the fight to be going on right now between those two power conferences. You want ESPN and Fox to fight for the asset so that you're in a position to say, well, you know, if you're offering me half, no, I'm going there. They're offering me full, or they're covering the costs of our expenses for this lawsuit, or whatever it might be. And every week we hear another story involving Florida State and Clemson. Every week we hear another story about the way conference realignment's going to look a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. Every week, those stories strike a chord with all of us as Noles because we're all very, very interested in how this game of Ring Around the Rosie ends up, right? We're all trying to figure out, what do we do here? When is it that we're leaving? How soon can we leave? We can't fall further behind. You know, those we seek to compete with in recruiting and on the field of play itself are all right here making a gazillion dollars all around us, but we're not. How long do we have to stay here before we get our piece and be able to fight a fair fight on a level playing field? And so I get it, man. I get why our fan base reacts to that piece of cheese that's dangled. We get it. I've gotten to where maybe I'm callous, maybe I'm jaded. I don't respond to those stories. So my bad yesterday. I should have responded to that story because Ross Dellinger is a respected journalist and people do listen when he speaks because he doesn't make things up.
Because if you're headline grazing, and that could be something like you see a headline on an ESPN.com or you see a tweet from a news outlet, but you don't actually click the article, so you get the gist of the juicy headline and the lead, but not the substance of it. Ross's quote is purely speculative, and it shows how far down the list the Big 12 actually is for Florida State and Clemson, because he calls it option 3. And option 2 for Florida State would be to still remain in the ACC, and they knock 8 teams out of the conference. And so they're down to 10. Like, they don't have the votes in the ACC to contract the conference they just added 3 teams to go down to 10. And then if neither of those things work, well, there's only one power conference left. And that's what he says. There's only one other power conference league, and that's the Big 12. So just if you were only headline grazing, the substance is, man, that ain't even on the docket for Florida State.